And welcome back to the channel with another video. Here we are talking about Irish slavery. That's right, you heard correctly, Irish slavery, or the enslavement of the Irish people in our history. And February surprise. I got a little surprise for you here with some commentary in this video, but the first thing I want to talk about, I want to point your attention to this website, globalresearch.ca. It's interesting how .ca is for Canada, is the domain extension for Canada. I find it interesting how this, I couldn't find this on a .com or an extension that's that's known to be American. Okay. The Irish slave trade, the forgotten white slaves. This is actually a pretty sad story. I'm going to get to a few points. This is a book. It's written by, looks like Don Jordan and Michael Walsh, originally published in 2008. Let me get down here. It says here, if you can follow on the screen, it says, the Irish slave trade began when 30,000 Irish prisoners were sold as slaves to the New World. The King James I proclamation of 1625 required Irish political prisoners to be sent overseas and sold to English settlers in the West Indies. By the mid-1600s, the Irish were the main slaves sold to Antigua and Montserrat. At that time, 70% of the total population of Montserrat were Irish slaves. Okay, so let's continue. I was going to interject something there, but let's go ahead and continue. Ireland quickly became the greatest source of human livestock for English merchants. The majority of the early slaves to the New World were actually white. From 1641 to 1652, and this is the really sad part, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell from about 1,500,000 to 600,000 in one single decade. That is incredible. That is horrific what the British did to the Irish people and what they did to most of the world. Let me continue. I'll continue down here. This paragraph. During the 1650s, over 100,000 Irish children between the ages of 10 and 14 were taken from their parents and sold as slaves in the West Indies, Virginia, and New England. Okay, so there were white slaves in America. Now I know in the back of your mind there are a lot of questions. Okay, and I'm going to get to a few of the more salient points. I'm going to get to a few of the more important questions that really should be asked. In this decade, 52,000 Irish women, 52,000 mostly women and children were sold to Barbados and Virginia. Another 30,000 Irish men and women were also transported and sold to the highest bidder. Cromwell ordered that 2,000 Irish children be taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves to English settlers. Many people today will avoid calling the Irish slaves what they truly were, slaves. They'll come up with terms like indentured servants to describe what occurred to the Irish. However, in most cases from the 16th and 17th century, Irish slaves were nothing more than human cattle. As an example, the African slave trade was just beginning during the same period. It is well recorded that African slaves, not tainted with the stain of the hated Catholic theology and more expensive to purchase, were often treated far better than their Irish counterparts. This is very interesting. Okay, a little commentary on this first of all. The number one thing I want to ask you, the listener, and kind of a rhetorical question for the powers that be and those who determine our educational system. If there was Irish slavery in America, okay, as this article and as this book claims, why don't the Irish have an Irish History Month? All right, I want you to think about that for a second. Why don't the Irish have an Irish History Month? Okay, I'm going to get to that in a little bit. I want you to keep that in mind. All right, now let me go back here. Let's read here. African slaves were very expensive during the late 1600s, 50 sterling. Irish slaves came cheap, no more than 5 sterling. If a planter whipped or branded or beat an Irish slave to death, it was never a crime. A death was a monetary setback, but far cheaper than killing a more expensive African. The English masters quickly began breeding the Irish women for both their own personal pleasure and for greater profit. Children of slaves were themselves slaves, which increased the size of the master's free workforce. Even if an Irish woman somehow obtained her freedom, her kids would remain slaves of her master. Wow. Just reading this, it's just so dehumanizing. Just and I'm African American. My parents come from the Caribbean, and we discuss slavery because it's obviously thrown in our faces once a year. And all the time, it's just thrown in our faces. But for some reason, the Irish and the Slavs get a pass. I'm going to get into this. I got another article I want to show you. The Irish and the Slavs get a pass. Who are the Slavs? We'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, now this is interesting here. The settlers began to breed Irish women and girls with African men to produce slaves with a distinct complexion. These new mulatto slaves brought a higher price than Irish livestock and likewise enabled the settlers to save money rather than purchase new African slaves. This practice of interbreeding Irish females with African men went on for several decades and was so widespread that in 1681 legislation was passed forbidding the practice of mating Irish slave women to African slave men for the purpose of producing slaves for sale. In short, it was stopped only because it interfered with the profits of a large slave transport company. Wow, capitalism. Okay, you can go ahead and read the rest of this. Irish slaves sold to both America, Australia. Dumping of 1,300 slaves into the Atlantic Ocean so the crew would have plenty of food to eat. It's disgusting. And the same point I asked is here in the article. But where are our public and private schools? Where are the history books? Why is it so seldom discussed? Very interesting, and I'm gonna get into that. This is the but before I do, let's move over to the bbc.co.uk. We all know the BBC. Here the title is The Story of Africa, Slavery. Okay, let's move on from that. Let's get to the first part. It says the term slave has its origins in the word Slav. The Slavs, or the Slavs, who inhabited a large part of Eastern Europe, were taken as slaves by the Muslims of Spain during the 9th century. Alrighty. Okay, so let's move on. Let's go to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay, we used to have a set of these when we were younger. Now I'm sure they're out of business, as a lot of people are because of the internet. But check this out. Slav, member of the most numerous ethnic and linguistic body of peoples in Europe, residing chiefly in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, but extending also across Northeastern Asia to the Pacific Ocean. Slavic languages belong to the Indo-European family. Customarily, Slavs are subdivided into East Slavs, chiefly Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians; West Slavs, chiefly Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, and Wends or Sorbs; and South Slavs, chiefly Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Slovenes, Macedonians, and Montenegrins. Bulgarians, though of mixed origin like the Hungarians, speak a Slavic language and are often designated as South Slav. All right, so the term, according to this, the term slave is rooted in the word Slav. Apparently, I was watching another video, and it was a white guy who was doing the presentation. He was doing a book review of I can't remember his name at the moment. One of the most influential African American men who and scholars who influences the right, the political right. One of Sean Hannity and one of Rush Limbaugh's go-tos when in presenting their research. Very intelligent African American gentleman, and while he was reviewing a book that this gentleman wrote, and the book was talking about the similarities between poor whites and language and the dialect and the language that they spoke, and poor blacks who had come out of slavery, and how they got the language from the poor whites. And he actually traces it back to a place in England, where he traces it back exactly to where they got. So what he's saying is, according to research, African Americans pick up a lot of their dialect from poor whites. Okay, so this is very interesting. I'm going to do a video on that as well. But to finish this discussion, I just want to point this out. In America, once a year, February, African History Month. Why is it that African Americans have a month to themselves? Okay, I'm African American, and it seems like such a wonderful gesture. Here's a whole month. But let me point something out. African American History Month is not what we thought it was. It's not what it purports to be. It's not what people really think it is. It seems great as on the surface. Oh yeah, we get a month to talk about slavery. Okay, that's not wonderful. There's nothing wonderful about African American History Month. As a matter of fact, to make African American History Month great, what you do is you talk about all the modern inventors and scientists, the people behind a lot of the more popular inventions and science that we have. That's what you do. But instead, it's a time, I see it as a time to propagandize the country. And according to some research that I read, they say that fifth graders in fifth grade is when there's usually a separation. This is about the time when they start teaching everyone about slavery. Okay, the African slave trade and the history of Africans in America. And what's interesting is this is the time period when they start to notice a major shift and a split between the white students and the black students. How about that? Now, would it surprise you that this would be the intended result? Would it surprise anyone that for a country that has tried to maintain segregation and separate schools, that this is a mechanism that they put out there as something that's good, but the intended consequences are segregation itself within the school. But notice, the Irish, okay, have no recognition of their slavery. I was talking to a French Canadian friend, and she informed me that the French Canadians, the whites in French Canada, Quebec, Montreal, etc., that whole region, the Francophone people there, the French-speaking people, were themselves slaves to the British in Canada. I didn't know that. That's interesting. And these are facts that aren't brought out. And there's a reason why. It's because it's omission. It's an omission in history because it doesn't serve their purposes. Okay? February, although it seems like a wonderful time for African Americans, I would advise you to rethink, based on this information that I'm giving you today, rethink February. Why do we have February? I was trying to talk to some friends about African American History Month, February, and I was telling them, look, I said, I don't think this is a good thing. Japan scrubs their history books. Okay. China scrubs their history books. Everyone scrubs their history and tries to put forward a good face. They try to save face, basically, and try to put a good image forward. But what's interesting is that in America, we are all far too eager to produce African American History Month. And here's the final nail in the proverbial coffin that will definitely show you that African History Month is a farce. February is a farce. You have to be very wary. You have to be very wary of the concept of Black History Month and the eagerness to give you Black History Month, but the material itself is being controlled and dumbed down and very simplistic and very, oh, you were slaves, you escaped slavery, blah blah blah, Martin Luther King, okay, and it eliminates all of the modern advancements and in education and the real history. Forget about that other stuff. Who cares about that? It eliminates the real history now, and a lot of it is just propaganda. Now, how do we know this? Because if they cared so much about African Americans and this African American History Month, February, the month of February, African Americans would have received reparations a long time ago. Okay, African Americans would have received 40 acres and a mule a long time ago. But that shows you, this goes to show you that this isn't the true intent. In addition, the fact that Irish History Month and the fact that the Irish were slaves in America, in Virginia and throughout the South, okay, the fact that that's omitted from history and they're given a pass and they're not given their own month to celebrate this history should tell you everything. All right. Anyway, February surprise, Irish slavery. If you like this video, go ahead and like it, share, and definitely comment below if you have any comments. And that's it. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching.